To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And this is the series of the podcast where we are going to be talking about every single film to come from the Walt Disney Animation Studios. And right now, we're going to be talking about Peter Pan. Now, if you think about Peter Pan, you might think, yeah, he originated in a book called Peter Pan. That is actually not correct. See, the character of Peter Pan first appeared in a 1902 novel by J.M. Barrie titled The Little White Bird. This book isn't a Peter Pan book, rather a collection of short stories. In 1904, J.M. Barrie took the Peter chapters of The Little White Bird and adapted it into a stage play with the title Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. After the success of the play, the Peter chapters of the original book were taken and adapted into the book Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. Then in 1911, Barrie expanded on the play to write Peter and Wendy, which was a novel. It was shortly after that in 1913 when Walt first encountered Peter Pan. He saw a touring theater company production of the stage play, and in 1924, 1 year after he moved to Hollywood, he saw a silent film production of it. That film was so state-of-the-art, it had special effects that no one had seen before, so naturally, Walt wanted to do a version of Peter Pan in his own style. We can actually trace production of Peter Pan back to as early as the 1930s during Snow White's production. Walt was very eager to get started with the Peter project as quickly as he could. Besides Snow White, Peter Pan was the character that Walt loved most as a child. During the early production of Peter Pan, he was quoted as saying, "There are many advantages with animation when compared to the stagecraft of Barrie's day," meaning that Walt recognized that they could do more with the animation medium. The only problem, however, was Disney didn't actually own the rights to make Peter Pan. See, unlike Snow White or Alice in Wonderland, the property of Peter Pan was not in the public domain. In 1937, J.M. Barrie had willed the rights to his play to a hospital, believe it or not. And unfortunately, Paramount beat Disney when it came to getting the rights from the hospital. However, Paramount did end up making an agreement with Disney, selling the rights for an animated feature film. As early as 1939, we started to see ideas get floated around about what they were going to do with the story and any possible changes they were going to make from the original source material. There were several versions of the story, like all movies, before we got to the final one. Some rejected story ideas were Nana actually going with all the kids to Neverland, in which the entire movie would be done through Nana's narration. Another one were the Darling kids stumbling upon pirate treasure within Skull Rock, and that story actually got much darker than Walt was comfortable putting in one of his movies. Then the movie was actually going to open up with the Peter Pan origin story of his birth and how he came to be, but eventually Walt decided that it was best to just start the same way as Barrie's original play did, inside the Darlings' nursery. The weight of making Peter Pan started to sit heavy on Walt. Peter Pan was probably the most popular character that the Walt Disney Studios have ever tried to adapt. Walt said, "We had somehow to recreate the essence of make-believe and do it in such a way that millions of people who have known and loved Barrie's play since it was first performed would recognize it and approve of what we had done." By 1941, they had a basic story structure written and were ready to go into production. But then Pearl Harbor unfortunately happened, leading into World War II, and that put a hold on Peter like it did for so many other movies. Disney was needed to make propaganda movies for the government, and any development on any feature-length movies was halted. But after the war, production quickly started again for Peter Pan. The production for Peter Pan was anything but smooth sailing, as it seemed to be with every movie that Disney has made up to this point. Studio staple Jack Kinney was tasked by Walt to be one of the first main contributors for Peter Pan. Walt asked Jack to do this in an almost unconventional way. Instead of finishing the entire script before starting to storyboard it, Walt wanted Jack to storyboard the scenes consecutively rather than doing it after the story was complete. This process took Kinney 6 months, and he presented them to Walt in around a 2.5-hour presentation. The first thing Walt said after this presentation was, "I've been thinking of Cinderella." So he didn't directly say, "I don't like it." However, he switched his focus to Cinderella, and as we know, Cinderella was the first Disney movie to come out after the war. The production of, I should say, this is the first true movie to come after the war, like I said, was, of course, Cinderella. And the success of Cinderella was exactly what Disney needed in that time. They were able to do full-length feature films again, rather than just shorts for the government or movies comprised of various shorts. But after Cinderella gave them a much-needed confidence boost, Peter Pan was again put into production quickly. It was traditional for a female to play the role of Peter in the stage productions and even in the silent film versions of Peter Pan. To cast Peter Pan, however, they knew they wanted an actual boy, and so they looked in studio at a child actor named Bobby Driscoll, who starred in the first live-action Disney movie, Treasure Island, as well as Song of the South and So Dear to My Heart. For the role of Wendy, they actually just used Catherine Beaumont again, who voiced Alice in the studio's previous film. Milt Kahl was the most talented animator at Disney. So, naturally, Walt gave him the hardest character to animate, that being Peter himself. The reason being that it was hard to animate a character with a feeling of weightlessness to him. There were moments where Peter didn't necessarily fly, he was just floating around in the air, and that was a really hard thing to capture. The look of Peter also was a hard thing to nail down. They had trouble making him look too manly and masculine. After all, he was a boy, he shouldn't look too much like a grown-up. There is still a strong legacy attached to this movie and character. The Peter Pan ride can be found on every continent in which a Disney park exists, and Tinkerbell has her own line of films, and you won't have a hard time finding Peter Pan merchandise in the parks. The Peter Pan ride at Disneyland is continuously one of the most popular rides there. If we talked about Alice in Wonderland being the genius of random and nonsensical comedy, Peter Pan is pure Disney genius when it comes to making you feel like you are young again, reliving all of the stories that you created in your own bedroom. After all, that is the premise of Peter Pan, the boy who would just never grow up. And while watching Peter Pan, you definitely feel like you are a kid again. After all, just like Walt said, adults are just kids grown up. The movie gets into this idea right away. We start in the nursery of the Darling home. John and Michael are playing Peter Pan, jumping from bed to bed, picturing a fight on the seas of Neverland. During this fight, John is using a clothing hook as a hook for Captain Hook, but he has it on the wrong hand. Wendy corrects him and then continues playing. It's understood from this moment, as well as what the narrator tells us, that Wendy is the Peter Pan lore master, for a lack of a better term. She is the one that introduced the story of Peter Pan to her brothers, and the brothers have loved every second of it. They have created this version of Peter Pan in their mind, and it's what they have gone off of, creating the imagination in their room. The spirit of imagination is very much alive in this movie, and when they get to Neverland, it just continues to show that we are living in the pure, fun imagination of these kids. But it's fun to think about, did these events actually happen, or are we just watching the pure imagination of these kids play out? When I was watching this scene at the scene of the Indian tribe, my wife walked into the room. The chief of the tribe was doing sign language, and John was able to interpret what the chief was saying. My wife asked the question, how does he know what he is saying? I didn't give an answer then, but my answer now is it's his imagination. Of course he can understand what the chief is saying. It's the story he is creating. It's his story that he is in charge of. You see evidence of this all over the movie, and if you want to believe they actually go to Neverland, that is awesome. But for me, I almost like taking the angle of we're just watching their imagination come to life. Now you might say, what about the end when Mr. Darling sees the ship in the clouds? I just think that is also in the kid's imagination. He is coming home from a party, giving in that Wendy doesn't have to go and sleep in a separate room anymore. And I think that is just the kid's imagination working, hoping that they will be able to continue to share a room. But it is also a very fun way looking at the movie that they did actually go to Neverland. So whatever way you decide to look at it, and I'm assuming most of you are going to decide that they actually did go to Neverland, it's a charming time no matter what way you look at it. The world of Neverland is actually really fun, but there are some things that kind of threw me off, some things that I feel like didn't feel in place. These are very nitpicky things, granted, I understand that, but I feel like it would have only enhanced the feeling of Neverland. For example, during the Follow the Leader scene, John, Michael, and the Lost Boys walk under a rock that an actual bear is on. The bear sees Michael's stuffed bear and gets a confused look on his face. There's also a scene where a monkey steals John's hat, and I don't know, just monkey and bears just seem out of place in a world with mermaids. But at the same time, the crocodile, a normal animal, doesn't feel out of place, but there's something mysterious about him that makes him fit into Neverland. Maybe that's because it's so intertwined with Hook's character that they just go hand in hand with each other. Or should I say, hand in stomach, because the crocodile ate Captain Hook's hand. I'm sorry, that was a terrible pun. But speaking of Captain Hook, I want to talk about him for a minute. He is an excellent villain in this movie. It kind of gives very slight Harry Potter and Voldemort vibes. A grown adult whose arch nemesis is a kid. But I like to think that since Peter doesn't grow up, he has been terrorizing Hook for a very, very long time. If I was Hook, I would be upset too at being outsmarted by a boy, especially if that boy was responsible for making a crocodile bite my hand. And to a certain extent, I am partly on Hook's side. His motivations are ones that are truly of revenge. They hint that they had history before the hand, but the fact that the crocodile ate his hand is definitely the biggest catalyst of their versus relationship. Hook is a menacing pirate, but that is juxtaposed by his cowardly fear of the crocodile. It really is an interesting dynamic to have in the main villain of the story. One thing that I think is clever, and the tradition is as old as the original stage play, is Captain Hook is the same actor as Mr. Darling. So in the real world and in Neverland, the two antagonists are by the same person. I also want to briefly talk about the character of Tinkerbell. By far, I feel like this is the character that has been the most popular to come from this movie. She has inspired numerous spin-offs and is part of some very iconic moments in the Disney parks, like flying over the castle for fireworks. But she is a little pain in the butt in this movie. She's annoying. That Tinkerbell that a lot of us have fallen in love with is not the same Tinkerbell from this movie, at least for the majority of the movie. But regardless, I can totally understand why she has become such a popular character. She's spunky, she's funny, and the design of her is very cute. I opened this pack of mystery pins from the Disney parks recently with popcorn buckets that look like Disney characters, have Disney character aesthetics to them. Before I recently watched this movie, I didn't have any attachment to the Tinkerbell one that I got, but now I cherish that Tinkerbell popcorn bucket pin. I know a lot of people have close attachment to Peter Pan. A lot of people think that Peter Pan is their favorite Disney movie. Peter Pan was never a movie I grew up with. I don't have any nostalgia for this movie. However, with that being said, I believe that anybody can watch this movie and instantaneously fall in love with it. Cinderella was all about dreaming, Alice in Wonderland was all about nonsensical funny comedy, and Peter Pan is all about having a lasting imagination. No matter how old you are or who you are, you can relate to the core themes of Peter Pan of never being too old to have a little imagination in you. Right now on my list of Disney animated movies, Peter Pan is at number 5, right below Cinderella and above Fun and Fancy Free. Thank you for listening to this episode of This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. Thank you for listening, and always remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.